Today is Max Kolbe of escapingatheism.com. It's a fantastic website, and I don't know, would you describe it as a ministry, Max?
We've shied very hard away from calling the Escaping Atheism project ministry. Ministry happens, what you might call ministry happens around it sometimes as somebody becomes curious. But we actually have a large team in place. They're all different flavors of Christian, but but not the same type at all. Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, Catholic. We even have one pagan who is not a Christian. And on the Escaping Atheism project, for a wide variety of reasons, we don't attempt to convert people to Christianity. We hope it gets them curious about it, but that's a different ball game. We are defending the faith, and we're being secular about it, which means we actually defend Jews, Hindus, philosophical theists of no particular religion, because we're of the opinion that atheism has gone well beyond what it was when I was a kid and when I was an atheist, because I did used to be an atheist, and has become very much a movement ideology, and especially online in social media, as well as in academia and other places. Atheists are frequent bullies, even to people that Christians would have trouble with. I mean, like, I've seen witches complaining how much they can't stand atheist bullying. And I'm like, well, I'm on your side on that one. We don't attempt to push the Christian message on escaping atheism. We are looking at starting an actual ministry, which will have its own name. It's probably going to be called Little Orthodox. But yeah, on escaping atheism, we're ready to defend anybody. So we wind up with fans who are Shinto. Well, I don't know if we have any Shintoists, but we do have, Jews, various types of pagans who like what we're doing. All focused on the fact that ideological atheism, militant atheism, is a movement and it's an ideology, and it's spread a lot of lies about religion generally into the culture through the education system and through mass media. So, I mean, we stand ready. We've defended Buddhists who were murdered by the atheist, communist Maoists, who were not atheists, by the way. Most Buddhists did not used to be atheist. Most Buddhism today that you hear about claims to be atheist or have no specific spiritual beliefs. That was not historically true of most Buddhists. That is Chinese government-approved Buddhism. So, yeah, we see atheism as a malevolent force, and bad cultural force that's destructive to everybody. So that's where we're coming from. And it's certainly provocative, but it's getting people's attention, too.
And who is Max Kolbe?
Well, in real life, I go by the name Dean Esme. You've probably seen me in Red Pill Movie and other things like that. I use the name Max Kolbe as a working name. Everybody on our team flies under the name of a saint. Even our pagan has a pagan saint he flies under. Max, the real Max Kolbe is named Maximilian Mary Kolbe. He was a martyr, a Christian martyr, murdered by the godless Nazis at Auschwitz. He had been running a war hospital, and he was taken away for being a faithful Catholic priest. The Nazis murdered quite a few priests there in Poland, and he was one of them. So I periodically, our Twitter is actually a group account. It's called the Max Kolbe Group, and we remind people regularly on it how he died, why he died, etc. So he's also my confirmation saint.
So where do you think, because I, for a while, chose the path of folly and was taken in by the New Atheist movement back in, I don't know when that was, 2009 or so. And I feel like their cultural influence has decreased since that period. The unholy trinity of Dawkins and Dennett and who else is in there? Hitchens, yeah. So where do you think the current state of atheism is in terms of that kind of militant evangelistic atheism?
Well, the new atheist movement, which was very easily, you can prove this now. This isn't just my opinion or something I pulled out of my butt. The New Atheist Movement was a planned propaganda campaign. All four of those guys that you just named have been shown, not by me, but by far more credible sources than me, to have engaged in real pseudo scholarship. Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins, especially Dawkins, Harris, and Hitchens, have been shown to engage in what do you call it when you plagiarism? Plagiarism of pseudo scholarship, where one of them will make a claim or make an assertion about history or make an assertion about religion that he's either got no source for at all, or that he's got a really dodgy, easily debunked source, but then the other authors would cite him as if what he had said was legitimate. So you had to go through this whole path to find that most of their scholarship is pseudo scholarship. And that's because the intent of the New Atheist Movement was to popularize atheism. That's why anybody who had good arguments against them was ignored and shut out. And there are a lot of good, smart people who had arguments against them who were completely ignored and avoided by all those four horsemen. Now, in terms of the influence of those original four, it's true that they very vastly waned. So what you might call the New Atheism, I would say more or less is dead, like Christopher Hitchens, who stands in death discredited, by the way. He was a plagiarist and a pseudo-scholar. So he's dead. Sam Harris no longer calls himself an atheist, yet he's still very popular. He's still very respected. And he still says all kinds of things he can't back up, and truly is guilty of all that pseudo-scholarship. Undeniably so. But see, the New Atheist Movement, if you look at it, again, I can show you sources on this, including an interview I did with a very distinguished professor named Borden Painter. They were all recycling 19th century Marxist propaganda on religion. They just were. You can see that in all of them. Their claims are almost all rote talking points out of something called the League of the Militant Godless that ran in Russia under the communist government there. Most of their talking points and most of their reasoning comes out of that. And that kind of reasoning, that fake history about religion, the fake history about whether it's Catholicism or any other form of history of Christianity, they made a bunch of stuff up about it that just isn't true. All this stuff about science that Christianity being the enemy of science, blah, blah, blah. They got it all from that. And that stuff is typical indoctrination now in a lot of schools, especially at university. Although from what I've gathered all over Canada and all elsewhere, that false history they spread is frequently making its way into, primary education, like at high school levels and such like that. So the influence of what we call the New Atheists, those four horsemen, has waned to very little, although Sam Harris still has way too much respect. He still gets too much of that. But the things they taught are increasingly normalized in the culture. And since the things they taught are clearly false, that's a serious problem. And I think it's a problem that religious people, especially Christians, but also other religions, are going to be dealing with for the next decade or so, until enough people, point out that, Bill Maher's a liar, Penn Jillette's a liar, the four horsemen are liars. They make stuff up about history, and they make stuff up about religious people. And they still even arrogate to themselves the role, the people who call themselves atheists, who are influenced by this ideological movement. They don't call themselves new atheists. They just say, well, I'm just an atheist. There's no ideology. But they repeat the ideology. So it's a toxic cultural force, and that's why we're here to fight it.
What do you make of the rise of Jordan Peterson? He is, I think, fighting that kind of cultural Marxism, the postmodern philosophy that underlines, as you say, much of our education and much of the assumptions of our society. I feel like there is somewhat of a sea change in that there is some fight, including your group, and it's actually making some inroads.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the
Oh, I was just
question.
gonna say, what do you make of Jordan Peterson?
Oh,
And
what do I make of Jordan Peterson?
hmm
Yeah, Jordan Peterson could not have come at a better time. He's really interesting for me to watch because I sometimes I think he takes 2 minutes to explain things that a person who actually believes in God would get within seconds, right? But he's talking to an audience that has been miseducated about the idea of God and miseducated about Christianity their whole lives, or is in the process of being miseducated about it while they're in church or while they're in college or whatever. Um, so he's climbing an amazing mountain, and he's doing a very good job of it. I think but it's obvious to me too that somebody like him was gonna show up. I truly believe that. Even from a purely secular modernist perspective, from a scientific perspective, you can look at it and you see the atheism and godlessness in general is not natural or normal in humans. It is just not. It's very abnormal. It can be shown to be scientifically abnormal to be atheist, but to be that hardcore godless, it's different when you're one of those people who's just kind of indifferent and not interested. That's not the same. But the whole idea that there's nothing spiritual, the whole idea that there's nothing that operates beyond the laws of physics and probability as we understand them, the whole idea that we are in a causeless, random, meaningless universe, A, does not actually make much logical sense, and B, it's not something most humans can deal with. It makes them nihilistic, hedonistic, everything becomes pointless. It is therefore predictable from a social science perspective that religion would make a comeback, because it's not normal for people to be highly irreligious. It's just not normal. In fact, one of the things you can see is that if they don't go religious, they usually go into some kind of hardcore economic or political philosophy. That's why both hyper-nationalism and extreme globalist communism are both getting popular now. People are seeking their sense of meaning either through the collective, the mass collective of socialism, or they're turning to worship the nation or their idea of their ethnicity, whether it's ethnic nationalism or just nationalist nationalism. They're putting God, they're putting the nation where God belongs. And people are just naturally religious in some way. And the secular order cannot present any kind of ethical or moral framework for living your life or any really good reason to even want to live. So people were going to start looking for God again. And I think long term, he's going to wind up causing a lot of people to abandon their atheism. But even if he hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it. Because God won't be ignored. Basically, that's the more spiritual way of putting it, and that's probably the more correct way too. The Holy Spirit will move people. It's just going to happen.
Absolutely. Now we're as people, as we're looking at our crystal ball here, but if more and more people that are atheist or maybe even agnostic and just semi-secular in their outlook, where do you see them going? Do you see them going to the church, or do you see them going? I mean, I've actually met. This is entirely anecdotal and probably isn't indicative of a larger trend, but I've recently met a lot of perennialists or people that are, trying to take wisdom from various religious traditions and kind of making a hodgepodge out of it. Where do you see it? Where do you see it headed?
I think that we're going to see, in fact, we are seeing a growth in witchcraft. We're seeing a growth in paganism, but theistic paganism. Like the pagan who's on our team has a firm idea of, he affirms God the way the ancient Christians affirmed that people like Aristotle and Plato and Socrates had the root God idea. So he's a monotheist. And his religion is actually Christian friendly, go figure. I won't get into the weirdness of it because it's his religion, but they're not Christian hostile. People who are into certain ancient pagan gods are making a comeback. I've interacted with people who actually literally are worshiping Thor, for example. And I'm just going to repeat, that's because people are naturally spiritual, and being an atheist is really weird and uncomfortable and doesn't make a lot of sense. I also see, I mean, we know that evangelical Christianity is still growing, but I think, to answer your question, we're going to see and are seeing more and more people getting curious about the spiritual. And I think there's a real opportunity in that for certain types of Christians. Christians who, I mean, evangelicals have always been a minority. It shocks some of them to hear that, but they always have been. I see an opportunity here for Catholics, for Eastern Orthodox, even for the old line Protestants like the Lutherans or the Presbyterians, to make a comeback, because, and you know, this is where we also get controversial. Most of us on the team would agree that evangelical Christianity's got problems, namely that it's got no consistent way of approaching the scriptures. And there's real benefit to going to an institutional body which has centuries of tradition that says this is the correct approach. And so I think the organized denominations are actually going to see a comeback, and some are, especially the Eastern Orthodox in the United States. They're just exploding right now, and I've got to say, I find that fantastic. I hope more people who are in the evangelical fold or completely unfamiliar with Orthodox Christianity investigate it. Because Orthodoxy has a lot to offer that people don't know about. So I sound weird, but I really think that by 2020 we're going to see a complete reversal, and the culture is going to get more religious. It's just a matter of what religious direction is it going to take.
I agree that you're correct in identifying the trend of, especially in Orthodoxy, in Eastern Orthodoxy, converts from evangelical background. Hank Hanegraaff of Bible Answer Man was somebody who recently made that plunge as well. And I just wanted to ask, what do you think is driving that trend? I mean, I have a little bit of my own theories in regards to the banality of worship and the general structure of non-denominational Protestant churches, and then also the internet has changed things a little bit, where obviously sola scriptura is one of the bedrock of the Protestant faith, but now you can go on the internet and you can find someone making arguments and interpretations of any verse, taking wildly different conclusions. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but what do you see as the reason why, in particular, evangelicals and Protestants are interested in the Orthodox faith?
Well, I can just tell you what my perspective is and what the perspective is of others I know who've been drawn to it or a part of it. I grew up, my religious education wasn't great, but I grew up in the 70s. I'm an old guy. I grew up in the 70s. On one side, Calvinist, Presbyterian, actually, was baptized by the Presbyterians and confirmed by them at roughly age 13, I think. And on my dad's side, it was King James, fundamentalist, and watching people like Oral Roberts and Pat Robertson of the 700 Club. And I'll just be blunt, one of the reasons I became an atheist is because I saw no consistency out of anybody talking about the Bible. I didn't see it coming from anybody. And I had trouble even believing in the idea of God at all. And so then when you're exposed to this mixed mash hodgepodge, almost crazy quilt way of reading the scriptures, and you meet so many guys who are positive they have the right read, but they don't agree with the other guy who has the right read, that's a serious problem. And I think, privately, even like Baptists and other evangelicals admit that it's an issue. It's in fact kind of visible in a lot of evangelical and other Protestant circles, is that they resolve arguments by agreeing that the Catholics have it wrong. You see it all the time. I've said it so many times. I was not a Catholic until I was in my 40s, and I was attracted to Catholicism. Certainly there were family reasons, but I wasn't going to join unless I believed it. And the solution to me was to study Orthodoxy. In fact, my favorite Bible is still the Orthodox Study Bible, which is issued by the Eastern Orthodox, who are at times critical of Catholics, and that's fine. But it's still my favorite study Bible, and I recommend it highly, the Orthodox Study Bible. Great footnotes, really readable translation. It's even got a copy of the Septuagint in it, the only English language translation of the Septuagint that I'm aware of. Anyway, what I discovered in looking at not just the Eastern Orthodox, but the Oriental Orthodox, the Coptics, and all of these, is that basically there are four main groups that can reasonably trace their history truly to the early church. And what they all offer is a consistency of teaching. I mean, certain things, of course, there's always going to be theological arguments over, but when you look and say, wow, look, here's this group of Christians who split from both the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, in the 400s, literally almost 1600 years ago, and they still have priests, they still have bishops, they still call Mary the Mother of God, they still celebrate the Eucharist, they still have confessions. You start going, oh, all those things that were just uniquely Catholic aren't uniquely Catholic. And what all of them, including the Catholics, offer is stability of teaching. You're basically, on the really big important questions, you're going to get the same answer no matter which priest you ask or which congregation you go to, you're going to get the same answer. Not on everything, but on an awful lot. And that means something, especially in a world that's increasingly unstable and nobody knows what's up and who's what and whatever. And here's 5 different interpretations of this book. And now we have the people who say, yeah, for 16, 17, 1800 years, we've all said that means this. That's very powerful because that means you're beyond some individual's interpretation. You can say that these were answers that were established long before anybody was alive, and we haven't changed them since. That's the benefit of councils. That's the ecumenical councils. That is the benefit of doctrines and dogmas and creeds and faith statements. I mean, I'm to the point where even if you're going to be Protestant, that's fine. If you don't have dogmas, creeds, and somebody who you can point to as an authority who will give authoritative answers for your group of Christians, I don't want to hear from you because you're just another mook talking. That sounds harsh, right? But really, I think something very important is to be said about authority. And by authority, I don't mean the right to command you. I mean the authority of being the learned person who has the answer that we're going to be adhering to as a group, as Christians, either as all Christians or at least this group of Christians. We've taken this stance. Mary is the Mother of God. We're not arguing with it about it anymore. Just to say take one example. That's powerful because it leaves you as the spiritual seeker more able to work on your relationship with God rather than this sort of squirrely, autistic, find the Bible verse that matches what I'm looking for approach. So yeah, I'm a big advocate for orthodoxy. Even if you're going to be Protestant, please God, be a Lutheran. I mean it sounds harsh, but I mean it. The call of orthodoxy is to say, listen, we don't care how charismatic you are as a preacher. We don't care how persuasive you might be at the moment with that Bible in your hands. We need to know what the answer is that we can all count on as the real answer. And that's what orthodoxy provides. And I think it's very attractive to people once they find out about it.
So we've been talking a little bit about orthodoxy, and there's obviously a difference between a capital O member of the Orthodox Church and lowercase o. Could you explain the difference? And is there because I obviously I think a lot of Christians or Protestant Christians would say, oh well, I'm lowercase Orthodox as well. So could you explain what that the differences between those and what that means?
Well, if you look at the creeds, this is in a couple of the creeds, right? But if you look to the creeds professed by most organized Christian denominations, you will find that in the creeds is the phrase, I believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church. The word Catholic in that actually means universal, and Orthodox means correct teaching. And so actually the Eastern Orthodox claim to be the Orthodox Catholic Church. the Oriental Orthodox, the non-Chalcedonians, claim to be the Orthodox Catholic Church, and that's where they start disagreeing. Now, I did leave Protestantism, so it is hard for me to credibly defend Protestantism, but I would say that a Protestant group can reasonably call itself Protestant Orthodox somehow by affirming the councils and affirming things like the real presence in the Eucharist. Affirming the Eucharist in the first place would be helpful too. If you're going to call yourself Orthodox as a Christian, I better see Eucharist, I better see sacrament, I better see taking, valid Trinitarianism. You better be taking Trinitarianism seriously. If you're not a Trinitarian, you're not in any way an Orthodox Christian. I can't lay down the rules, but for everybody. But I would say, look, if you can go back to the first 4 ecumenical councils, and you can credibly say you think you're teaching what they taught back then, you're at least reasonably close to some kind of orthodoxy. And if you're not, and you've just got a Bible in your hand and a firmly stated opinion that you can yell real loud, I'm not going to call you Orthodox. So I don't know if that answers your question enough, but it's how I see it.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think that speaks to, especially among evangelicals and just in general, I don't think church history is something that is taught very well. I mean, the classic thing, of course, is the fact that the Bible that we have, was affirmed by
an ecumenical council.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you would feel comfortable, but could you talk a little bit just about the history of the councils, to someone who might not know much about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is something, even growing up a Presbyterian, which is pretty far from Orthodoxy in a lot of ways in my eyes, but the Presbyterians, if you look at the original Protestant reformers, including Luther and Calvin, they affirmed the ecumenical councils, and the denominations bearing their names, the Presbyterians, the other Calvinists, the Lutherans, all affirmed those ecumenical councils. I would suggest going ahead, although Google's not your most reliable research tool, and Wikipedia is not either, you can certainly start there and just Google the ecumenical councils. There's like 7 of them that something like 90% of the world's Christians, at least 85% of the world Christians, including most Protestant groups, all hold on to them. And what they are is meetings of the prominent Christian leaders from around the globe to get together and resolve contentious issues, such as, is Mary the Mother of God or not? Well, that was affirmed at the 4th Ecumenical Council. That was her. It's been her title since then, and that was in 451. So again, you got a almost 1600 year run there that has been affirming Mary's status as the Mother of God for most Christians. Look into them. There are certainly good books on them. Some are written from a Protestant perspective, some are written from a more traditional Orthodox perspective, but there's a lot of books on those ecumenical councils. And the early ones are crucial, but the early ones are doing things like affirming the Trinity. It's where the idea, where the doctrine of the Trinity really comes from, or where you should be starting from if you're going to understand the Trinity, is the documents of the ecumenical councils. The way we would put it, some Protestants would object, but the way we would put it is those are meetings of the bishops and people who worked with the bishops, some priests and some theologians, but they're recognized authorities. They were recognized authorities in the Roman Empire. They were recognized authorities also in the Sassanid Empire. The ecumenical councils help resolve a lot of those contentious issues. So when you're doing something like reading, when Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," what exactly does he mean? If you go to the ecumenical councils, they settled this argument that he really means this is his body, that he really means this is his blood, and he wants you to eat and drink of it. That's not a matter for your personal opinion anymore. That's been settled by an ecumenical council. So you either reject that council and cut yourself off from that group of Christians forever, which is most Christians in history and most worldwide, or you accept and affirm the council. and say, well, Christ said he wouldn't let us be led too far astray. If most Christians have been believing this since at least 451, there's probably something to it. This is a problem I see in all evangelical Christianity, the Bible-only approach. It's like when the bishops put together the Bible, you accepted that they picked the right books, but then you don't accept that anything else they said was correct either. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It's like history is, we had the first few centuries of the church, then we were given the Bible, and then no history happened for another 1,000 years until the Reformation came along. And that doesn't make a lot of sense either. There's a lot that people have learned. And another thing I think evangelicals, even if you're going to stay evangelical, start reading the church fathers, reading the desert fathers, reading people like St. Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, John Chrysostom. Start reading those people. Start understanding what the early Christians, how they really understood things, because how they understood things should give us a lot of insights today.
I think for some people that I talk to, it's like, well, no, there's sort of a historical skepticism where, okay, what we really want to do is get back to the Christianity that the early church established as it's recorded in Acts, and okay, then it gets a little fuzzy, because there's not much. They're looking at it almost from a scholarship standpoint of, okay, well, the history of the very, very early church, gets kind of murky there. How would you respond to that?
Well, from my perspective, the way I see it, and I think all Orthodox, not just Catholics, would take no big issue with this. They would probably all say, yeah, that's about right. Anybody listening can correct me, but I don't think they will. The way we tend to see it is the Bible came up organically. The faith existed before we had a Bible. Not everybody had all the same scriptures. That's why we eventually put together the scriptures. And those scriptures were to be considered the most important documents that affirmed all the things that the early church believed. But there were still things there that they assumed everybody knew. I will give you my favorite example. You just mentioned the book of Acts. Okay, in the book of Acts, we see the early apostles spring into action now that Jesus is gone, off to heaven. And one of the many things we see them doing, the apostles doing, is laying hands on people to add to their member. I don't have the verse handy. I'll go find it if anyone threw it. It's right there in Acts. You see them laying hands on people to bring them into the church. Now, hardly anybody actually does that anymore, although I understand some evangelicals have a practice like that. But what we think happened there is that was the apostles making other apostles, a.k.a. other bishops. And that's actually the same practice by which bishops eventually started making priests. And bishops started making priests when we got kicked out of the temple. We were no longer allowed to worship at the temple in Jerusalem. And then the temple was destroyed. None of this is in the Bible, by the way, but it's part of Christian history. When we were kicked out of the temple, we began doing worship services on our own, and we figured out we needed priests. That's part of the sacred tradition. When we were underground and outlawed, we had to meet in houses and other secret locations, but once it was legal again, we wanted to go back to the practices of the temple era. You'll even find churches today, Orthodox churches of all varieties, and what you find in the liturgy intentionally parallels and mimics what was known to go on in the Jewish temple before the Jewish temple was destroyed. So in other words, there's a continuous oral history there. And it's not all just oral, it's also written in non-biblical documents that you can go and look at now. The practices of having priests and rites and liturgy and sacraments all springs out of the early Jewish temple before the temple was destroyed and before we were kicked out of it. I would note that if you look in your New Testament, however, Jesus, there's a couple of times when, Joseph and Mary take Jesus to be presented at the temple. That's where they meet Simeon, who tells Mary, the future for her son. You have the incident where Jesus is forgotten at the temple when he's like 10 years old or something like 10 years old. The temple was a very important place you went to worship, including Jesus, who spent a lot of time there. So, early Christians did reason we're supposed to have something like a temple. Catholic, Orthodox, and other, even Anglican and Lutheran churches are modeled in part after the old Jewish temple. Not many people know that. So, but what I point out about all of this is like, wow, we've got a continuous Christian history here, and we've got continuous practices among Christians. Now we're not arguing over whether the Pope is right about something or not. We're able to, this is something that's really only developed in the last few decades, the ability to look. You can actually, like, old arguments between Protestants and Catholics frequently can be resolved by just going and looking what the other Orthodox are doing and saying, wow, you've been doing that for 1,600 years, huh? Okay, maybe Rome wasn't wrong about that one, right? Or, from any other tradition. I actually think the organized, the last 2 decades, and especially the last decades, has been an explosion of interest in Orthodoxy because I think a lot of people are finding what you just identified. There's so many parts of the Bible, it's like you could just argue all day over what they mean. But when you study Christian Orthodoxy, you go, snap, oh, that's what that means. Okay, that makes sense all of a sudden. And you stop having that, cognitive dissonance of, I can't figure this out. You start having faith in the church itself. And by the church, I don't mean your local priest. I mean you have faith in the institutional body that has endured for these 2,000 years, and you think Christ's promise to stay with us still holds. I think where you find the early church is in Christian Orthodoxy. That's just what I think.
Now, you are a Roman Catholic, and obviously the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox split in 1054, which is kind of amazing that because Protestants, we split off every day, so it's fairly recent history for us, but that split happened a long time ago. But do you think this is maybe just too much of a crystal ball question, but do you think that there will be a reunification of those two strands of Orthodoxy?
No, not well. Yes, eventually, if nothing else in heaven. I don't see the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics reunifying in my lifetime. I mean, you never know. You can hope, because it would be a great thing. But there's issues there, and it's mostly from the Eastern Orthodox side, by the way. I can tell you straight up, Rome's attitude is Eastern Orthodox, anytime you say we're ready to have you back. It's actually the Eastern Orthodox who are reluctant there, and we respect that. They do have some differences with us, okay? I would also say, though, that when you're looking at the Eastern Orthodox, they split off in 1054. Please also look at what are called the Oriental Orthodox or the non-Chalcedonian Orthodox. They split off in the 400s. And the Assyrian Orthodox split off in the early 400s, almost exactly 1,600 years ago, if I remember right. And again, the teachings and practices are more similar than they are different. So you're not even just looking at the Eastern Orthodox now. You should be able to, it's amazing. You can use these other denominations to go, oh, wow, the Eastern Orthodox didn't make that up. The Roman Catholics didn't make that up. We didn't make up priests. Or if we did, we made it up a really long time ago, just for one of many examples. Reunification, full reunification of any of these communions isn't possible, if only because sometimes there's political issues that make it impossible. Ethnic and cultural and political forces often array against it. Nevertheless, it is the case that since the mid-20th century especially, and especially the last 3-4 decades, it's almost miraculous. Many of these, there's something called the Pan-Orthodox movement. And the Pan-Orthodox, sometimes they include Rome, sometimes they don't. But the Pan-Orthodox movement is all these Christian groups that were used to be isolated by geography and time. How often does the average Catholic have to interact with a Coptic Christian from Egypt? Almost never, right? But now we're global, and all this global communication has allowed, for example, the Coptics, who are part of the, I believe they're part of the Oriental Orthodox communion. I believe they are. Out of communion with us for some time. But just in the last few decades, some have come back into communion with the Eastern Orthodox or with the Roman Catholics, basically by resolving theological disputes that went back to the 400s. I do think we're going to see more merging of some types of orthodoxy. Even the Anglican communion. I used to have a very dismissive attitude about the Anglican communion, which comes from England and derives from the time of Henry VIII. But one of our team members is Andrew Stratelites. He's a very serious-minded Anglican, and there is a big move toward orthodoxy, toward re-embracing orthodoxy within Anglicanism, of getting back to the early church councils, of getting back to the real practices. Some are calling it the neo-Orthodox movement. Other Anglicans now have special status where they're back in communion with Rome, but they're keeping all their old Anglican rites and songs and liturgical practices. I really think that whether you become Catholic or not, Christians who are searching for stability in spiritual teaching, all the Orthodox have what most of you are looking for if you're looking for stability.
Yes, and I think there's a couple other factors in the rise of Orthodoxy. One would be that the leadership of a lot of the mainline denominations, Protestant denominations, are, well, it's ironic saying this to a Catholic, but they're falling into apostasy in the sense of following the ways of the world, especially as it regards the homosexuals in leadership positions, especially as pastors, and following the current trends there. So I think a lot of evangelicals see that, and they see this happen. Now, obviously, they're among the lay. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but you can certainly see. I mean, the Anglican Church recently, followed that way as well. And then there's also, I think, a second factor, which is a reawakening in a sense of European history and identity as well. Do you think that those are driving the trend?
I'm not sure. I see a couple things happening there. It is true that the Anglican communion has exploded into chaos, but there's this neo-Orthodox surge within Anglicanism, especially south of the border in South America and Africa, where Anglicans who want nothing to do with this modernist stuff, like not just the homosexuality, but a whole host of issues, abortion, embracing secularism and forgetting the spiritual. There's a deep reaction within Anglicanism. Basically, probably pretty soon the Archbishop of Canterbury is going to be irrelevant to most serious Anglicans, because the dissolute liberal Anglicans, like you're talking about there, are also hemorrhaging members. Nobody wants anything to do with them. In fact, it sounds very politically incorrect, but I don't care. I'll tell you what the marker is for a Christian denomination that's about to go down the tubes. It's when they start ordaining women. Once they start ordaining women, the gay rights cause comes in within a few years behind them. And then what also tends to happen, and we're seeing this in a lot of churches, we're seeing this in some Catholic churches, we're seeing this in a lot of, don't get me wrong, you got to watch out for this among Catholics too, where basically politics starts becoming more important than the spiritual. So, fighting racism, fighting homelessness becomes a matter of, if you're a good Christian, you'll vote our way, you'll be a Democrat, or you'll be whatever, a progressive. That just alienates people and sends people flooding out of your church, as frankly it ought to. There is another side of it too. And this happens among some Orthodox too, where they get too tied up in nationalism and right-wing politics, and that represents a danger too, because again, you're putting your spirit, you aren't just taking your religious values to the ballot box. You're kind of mixing up your spirituality with the democratic process. How did I get off on that? What were we?
Oh, I was asking you about, whether you think those are trends that are driving people towards,
towards orthodoxy. They absolutely are. They absolutely are, because when you get too much politics in your spirituality, basically God starts taking a second seat to whatever your ideology is. The liberal denominations are hemorrhaging. Those who are more Orthodox are still growing. The Catholics in the United States and certain other parts of the world, it pains me to say it, right? But there are some Catholic parishes I would advise you to stay out of, because they have been, sometimes they use the word convergence. They've gone ahead and converged into modernist heresy and modernist politics. That's happened in some Catholic parishes. If you're thinking about becoming Catholic, please watch out for that, because not all parishes are like that, but some are. So don't rush to any judgments either way. In fact, right now, I would actually, some Catholics would scream at me, but I think that some Eastern Orthodox parishes are better for you than some Catholic parishes are right now. But again, I said some. What you really want to be looking for in any of these churches is, watch out, is modern politics intruding into the worship space? Because if it is, you're in a denomination that's got a problem. I'd even say that for anybody who's in a mega church. If your pastor is way too into being a Republican, then he's not enough into being a man of God. And that's happened within evangelical circles too. I'm just owning it though, because it's happened with Catholics, it's happened with other denominations.
Yeah, it's not, for any single denomination. It's a trend that is global. It is Catholic.
Yeah, you cannot. Don't ever think it's just the left. The right wingers insert their crap in too. We don't see a lot of that in the U.S., but you do see it elsewhere. And actually, the Eastern Orthodox are known to be prone to that outside the United States. But in any case, that's not what most people. If you're looking for God, you're not going to find him at the ballot box. That's kind of the way I would put that. So even if you're going to say an evangelical or whatever, find somebody who's stable and find somebody who doesn't think being Christian means vote Republican. Just like being a good Catholic doesn't mean voting Democrat or whatever. If you've got your politics that much in your religion is suffering. That's how I would put that.
To the soccer deacon, if you want to discuss orthodoxy as orthodoxy rather than someone outside it, you're welcome to. This is who we're talking to, so I don't want to hear you complaining about that. Sorry, it's annoying me. Anyways, so tell me a little bit more about your new project that you guys are putting together, the Lowercase Orthodoxy site, and what's your hope and goal with that, and why you're putting it together.
It is going to be called Little Orthodox. We used to say Little O Orthodox, but that's Little Orthodox works. Some strict Orthodox will probably howl and say there's nothing Orthodox about it. Others will look at it and I don't know what they'll say. It is, but the purpose is going to be to evangelize what we would call ancient, authentic Orthodox Christianity. This is the kind you don't hear enough about. So the kind that involves, yes, bishops, yes, priests, yes, sacraments, more than two. A firm, respect for the church fathers, a firm respect for the ecumenical councils. And so it will be an ecumenical effort, but it will be, one of the ideas will be to educate people about what is orthodoxy. Because I'm just being honest, I came up out of Protestant evangelicalism, and it just added to my confusion. And that's a testimony that I don't just give, but a whole bunch of people I've encountered now give. Pretty much anybody who went Eastern Orthodox will give you will tell you the same thing. I couldn't stand the chaos anymore. I couldn't stand all the arguing. I couldn't stand all these variant interpretations. I looked for stability. And so that is going to be what the Little Orthodox is about. Again, a strict Catholic will condemn us for saying we're not telling you to be Catholic. A strict Eastern Orthodox will get angry that we're not telling you to be Eastern Orthodox. But I mean, really, even if you're in one of the mainline denominations like Lutheranism, I would hope you would get a lot out of it because there's a lot to find out. Martin Luther was far more Orthodox than most people think. He recommended making the sign of the cross and did it all the time, that Catholics do. He affirmed Mary's the Mother of God, and he liked the Hail Mary prayer and said it was a good prayer to say. He had other theological disagreements, but the point is, a lot of these ancient Christian practices are really ancient and even are part of the Protestant heritage. And we want to educate people about all those things. So it's going to be called littleorthodox.net or .org. We've already secured the domain name. We haven't even begun building it, but that's going to be our focus. And that will be much more ministry oriented. The Escaping Atheism Project really is there to defend any religion against lies about that religion. We defend Hindus, we defend Buddhists, I'm going to be interviewing a witch soon who says he's part of a pagan group that has been operating continuously for thousands of years. It should be an interesting conversation. When we go a little Orthodox, we're going to be very Christian-centered, very Christ-focused, very Trinity-focused, very church-focused. So there you go.
I just want to circle back around for a final question in regards to the admixture of politics and religion. I think everyone that I talk to right now, wherever they fall, as everyone's pretty into politics, it's sort of it is the thing that people are most vociferously arguing about. And so I guess I was just asking, do you have any advice for a Christian how to navigate that intersection of politics and faith?
What I would say first off is begin reading Christian sources other than the Bible, and begin reading sources that go before not just this century, but before the 20th century. Start investigating the church fathers. Start investigating the ecumenical councils. Start reading about ancient Christian practice. And start reading some of the great spiritual masters. Read Confessions by St. Augustine. Read some John Chrysostom. The Eastern Orthodox especially love Chrysostom. And that's fine. I don't blame them. Because what you want is to be focused. Remember what the Bible says about the world. The world is evil. The princes of this world are evil. The princes of this world are evil is all over the Bible.
Now, that was today. The sermon was from Psalm 146, or I think that's what it is. Do not trust. Do not put your trust in princes.
Yes. Do not put your trust in princes. And what do they mean? I'll be honest. Whether you like or hate Donald Trump, don't put your trust in him. He's one of the princes of the world. He just is. I'm not saying he's satanic, but I would say the same for Obama. Or name a national leader anywhere. Name a politician everywhere. Anywhere. That's one of the princes of this world. So are rich, powerful men who aren't in politics but control things anyway. Those are the princes of the world. Those are who you're being warned about in Psalm 146. I'd also remind you that when remember the phrase, the devil may cite Scripture to his own purposes. Go to the New Testament. Go to where Jesus went out into the days fasting for 40 days and was tempted by Satan. One of the things Satan does is quote Scripture directly to Jesus to talk him out of going forward with his plan to sacrifice himself and save humanity. And he offers him the rule of all the kingdoms of the world. Satan offers him the rule of all the kingdoms of the world and cites scriptures showing that he's entitled to it. And Jesus says, no. All right, so there you have the devil properly quoting scripture and tempting Jesus with something horrible. So what you've got to remember is that everything of this world is passing. It's all ephemeral. It's all fleeting. Whether you believe we're in the end times or not, and by the way, I don't believe we're in the end times. I could be wrong, but whether we are or not, you should be acting as if you should be thinking about getting into heaven. You shouldn't be thinking about winning an election. In the end of the day, you're not in control. God is. And the evil forces of the world are evil forces in the world. Don't get sucked in by those people. The more confident you are in a human being, the more faith you're having in a human being or a leader, that's the less faith than you're having in God. So I guess that would be my general advice on your question. Think first of the spiritual. Think of Christ being tempted in the desert. Think of what the Bible says over and over again about trusting powerful man and what the world is really like, and you'll do better in your own spirituality and in your search for something stable.
Well, Max, thank you so much for joining us today in the Inferno. Do you have anything? I mean, your site, escapingatheism.com. You can follow Max on Twitter at what are your handles?
Can I mention? Yeah, I'll mention a couple. I'm also going to give a warning. Some Christians should not follow us, at least on the Escaping Atheism project. Some of them, we may not be to your cup of tea at all, because we've decided, amongst other things, to embrace the vulgar culture on its own terms. And we're not engaged in evangelism. We're engaged in defense of the faith. This means we are often coarse. We use harsh language. We're not nice. We call a liar a liar. We actually use we use common vulgarities that are part of the culture now. We argue that because it's part of the way the culture is now, certain words that you wouldn't use in church, we're going to go ahead and use them when we're out in public like this. And if that doesn't suit you, fine. You know, we're bruisers in a lot of ways. I'll go ahead and swear a little here. You can blame me out. It's called shit posting for a reason, and it's part of the culture. And that's what we do there. But you get us one-on-one, or when we begin actual ministerial work, we're not going to be that way. So do keep that in mind. We find young people like what we're doing more than older people. You can find us on escapingatheism.com. You can follow us at Escaping Atheism on Twitter. We're working on a Minds presence. The main place to go, though, for now, to know you'll find us, because we could get we have a YouTube channel. Find us on the Max Kolbe YouTube channel. But the best place to find us is always going to be escapingatheism.com, because these days our YouTube channel could disappear anytime. Our Twitter account could disappear anytime. But hopefully escapingatheism.com will be there. Come by and say hi. Just remember, we're not doing ministry work. We're engaging the secular culture on its own terms, so we're pretty abrasive, and we don't apologize for that. But anyway, please come check us out. You're very welcome. Anybody who's interested can come, of any religion.
All right. Well, thanks again, Max. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Hope you guys have a great week.